Good morning, everyone. Inside HR is back. I'm James Marsh. Thank you so much for joining us. We've got another cracking webinar to bring you over the next hour, and I have two great guests for you who will be sharing their insight and expertise on today's topic, which is the future of work. For those of you joining us for the first time, Inside HR is a series of webinars that explore the latest topics, issues and trends affecting management and HR practitioners across the UK and beyond, and brought to you by leading online management magazine HR Review. Today we've partnered with Workday, a leading provider of enterprise cloud applications for finance and human resources. They're founded in 2005. Workday delivers financial management, human capital management and analytics applications designed for the world's largest companies, educational institutions and government departments. So it's great to have them with us today. Organizations ranging from medium-sized businesses to FTSE 100 enterprises have selected Workday, and we're delighted to be working with them as well this morning. Before I introduce my guests, don't forget, as always on Inside HR, we want you to get involved over the next hour, and you can do so in a number of ways. You can ask questions by clicking on the Ask a Question button that you should see above the slide deck on your screen, and I'll be putting as many of those questions as possible to our panel towards the end of this hour. You can vote in our polls, the first of which we're going to launch very shortly, and we'll analyze those responses to the questions we're asking you and allow you to shape the discussion we have this morning. You can rate the webinar by clicking on the Rate This button, and we really do appreciate your feedback, all the feedback that you give us every time we do this. We really do appreciate it. And lastly, please do click on the Attachments button, and you can access a whole range of interesting links and resources from Workday. There's a link there from the CIPD as well, and other resources as well. So please do get involved with that. And so to my guest this morning, Richard Doherty is a Senior Director of Production Marketing at Workday with responsibilities for Workday's HCM and financial management applications, and he's going to be providing the perspective of an HR technologist. Prior to joining Workday, Richard was part of a team that pioneered cloud-based recruiting and talent management solutions in Europe, joining Job Partners as one of the first employees in the year 2000. Richard held a number of positions across professional services, sales and marketing, helping Job Partners grow into one of the market leaders in Europe. And in 2011, Job Partners was acquired by Taleo, the cloud recruiting and talent management leader at the time, and Richard subsequently spent time at Taleo and Oracle as HCM Strategy Director before joining Workday. He also holds a degree in economics from the London School of Economics. Richard, welcome to Inside HR. How are you this morning?
Good morning. Thank you very much, James. Great to be here.
No, it's a pleasure to have you. It's also a pleasure to welcome Kim Atherton from OVO Energy, who will be providing the perspective of a people leader. OVO Energy are an NTech challenger brand and one of the fastest growing organizations in the UK. Kim joined OVO 5 years ago and is now the Chief People Officer, and she's overseen rapid employee growth from around 100 to around 1,600 employees and taken the business from 172nd to 20th in the Sunday Times Best Places to Work. Prior to OVO, she was a chartered occupational psychologist, consulting globally with organizations including HSBC, Virgin Atlantic, and Novartis. Kim, good morning. Pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you so much, James. Lovely to be here.
Great. So that is our panel. Those are our guests for the next hour. Let me just rock you through our agenda very quickly. We're talking about the future of work, which is obviously a very broad topic, but we're going to hit some specific areas and spend some time discussing those particular topics. Firstly, we're going to start off with modernising the workplace. Then we're going to talk about the employee experience, how important that is and how that's changing. Changes in management style, the gig economy as well, which is a big topic. There's been a lot of recent judgments that have affected that as well, so we're going to talk about those. The benefits and pitfalls of AI is going to be the last area that we look at. Sorry, I beg your pardon, before people analytics, before then we get to your questions. So a lot to cram in over the next hour. And before we even start off with any of that, we're going to start off with a poll. So click on the Vote Now button and answer this question for us. How prepared do you feel your HR department is for the future of work? Very simple. Give us a response to that. Is it A, very well prepared, B, well prepared, C, we're getting there, D, badly prepared, or E, I'm just not sure? Let us know how you're feeling and how you think your HR department is positioned for the future at the moment, and we will use those results. We'll look at those very shortly, actually, and that'll help shape our discussion and the perspective that Richard and Kim bring to us. Right. Let's start off with talking about modernising the workplace. So Richard, I'm going to turn to you first. Before we look at the future, as a software vendor helping HR modernize right now with Workday, how ready do you think HR is for the future of work right now?
Right, thanks, James. So I think it's a good place to start is to take stock of where are we today, and obviously part of my role is working with organisations to help them modernize HR. And if we look at the slide there, according to Bersin by Deloitte, this is research from last year, only 40% of organisations have some kind of cloud HR systems. And why have I highlighted that statistic? Well, as we look to the future, the future is uncertain. But I'd actually say one thing is certain is that it's going to be changeable. We're going to have to be a very flexible function. We're going to need to adapt to changing working patterns, a changing workforce, competitive pressures, and so on. So, from a systems perspective, I would say HR technology is foundational to prepare HR for that uncertain future. So we need flexible systems that will adapt to that changing workforce and different ways of doing things. And it's if you look at the vendor side, all the innovation and all the investments going into the cloud solutions, the old on-premise solutions, which that other 60% must still be on, there's very little investment going into those solutions, and those solutions are at their core not so flexible. They're difficult to change. So. And then there's the second statistic there from some research that IDC released just last week, which was sponsored by Workday, where they surveyed digital leaders, and 80% of those digital leaders across Europe found it either difficult or impossible to adapt HR processes. So if you're in that state, then kind of adapting your organisation to cope with the future of work is going to be difficult. And just final thing for me to say is, I always look at that and I wonder, because I live and breathe, cloud technology, and I'm wondering, why aren't more organisations already, making that journey? And perhaps it's because, there's a misconception about, how difficult that journey is.
Sure.
When they look at the old, when they implemented their older system, maybe it took a long time, and to upgrade it is very difficult and expensive. Whereas, in the new world of cloud solutions, the projects are delivered in a much more standard manner, that's much more predictable. You have no more upgrades. So I would encourage people to modernize that technology core within HR to provide that strong foundation, for the future.
Sure. That's really interesting. Kim, just turning to you, what do you think some of the obstacles HR are facing as they seek to modernize? Is there a fear of modernizing technology, as Richard says, or are there other obstacles as well?
I think actually the obstacles are quite psychological in nature on one level. I think we're dealing here with themes that threaten a lot of senior people's sources of power. So, for example, we're going to, during the course of this hour, talk about the importance of breaking down hierarchies and distributing decision-making. And that actually goes to, is a threat to a lot of people who have seen decision-making as a source of power. And we're also going to talk about lots and lots and lots of change. So machine learning and AI, we're going to talk about automating certain tasks. And change generally is perceived by our human brains as a threat. And so actually I think a lot, when we talk about the future of work, I think it feels quite scary to people because perhaps we as HR practitioners need to really understand and address some of the perceived threats that some of these changes might bring.
That's really interesting. So actually, when we started off talking about modernization, we're actually talking a lot about modernizing mindset as well as modernizing the tools and processes and systems that we're using, which is fascinating. Just quickly want to turn back to the poll that we started off just a few minutes ago. How prepared do you feel your HR department is for the future of work? Just 3% saying very well prepared, 8% saying well prepared, 21% saying badly prepared, only 8% aren't sure. Overwhelmingly, 58% are saying we're getting there, right in the middle of the spectrum there. So there is some movement towards modernization, but they're not where they want to be. Richard, is that sort of something that reflects the kind of conversations you're having with clients of Workday?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's general recognition that HR needs to modernize for the reasons that Kim and I have just explained there. And the majority are either beginning that journey or are on that journey. Yeah.
Fantastic. Let's move it on then, and let's talk about the employee experience in terms of the future of work. So we want to talk about companies investing more in the experience of their employees. And Richard, from your perspective, what constitutes these days in 2018 a great employee experience?
So, I mean, I'm going to focus first of all on a bad employee experience.
Okay.
Before I even do that, I think the business case for investing in the employee experience is clear. There we've extracted some from an article in the Harvard Business Review that companies that invest in employee experience are up to 4 times more profitable. So the business case is clear. There's the data to support that investment, and that employee experience it's every interaction clearly between the employee and the employer, and that covers people, process, and technology. And if I talking about a bad employee experience, let's talk about just briefly about a bad process experience. So, performance management, the annual performance review or semi-annual performance review. I think everyone hates it. We'll recognise that it adds little value. And back in 2012, Adobe announced that they were scrapping performance reviews and moving to check-ins, and they've had tremendous success. And there's been a lot written about their experience, and the impression is that lots of other organisations are following. But we recently sponsored some research from the Forrester Groups and global research around performance management, and that research found that 65% of organisations are still actually doing annual or semi-annual performance reviews. So, organisations, I think they need to up their game in terms of looking at the processes that touch the employee and look at those processes from the perspective of the employee, from the employee's eyes, maybe use some design thinking or journey mapping to redesign those processes to provide that excellent employee experience. And then from a HR technology vendor's perspective, we're seeing a massive impact in terms of the demand from customers and prospective customers to focus on the employee experience. Previously, technology vendors in the HR space were focused more on sort of self-service and process standardization, which are things that are more about the organization than the employee. We're now being pushed by our customers to focus on the employee. And what does that mean? Well, we need to provide a more contextual and intelligent experience for the employee, because we've got all this data about the employees. And as in our consumer lives, we have effectively a bespoke experience when we engage with consumer brands. Employees need to have that same bespoke experience when they engage with their employer. And HR tech is well placed to provide that experience. And, ultimately we need to provide employees with modern tools available on the device of choice. We need to help empower those employees to manage their careers. And then, fundamentally make their lives easier. And then the final point, I think, from the future of HR and HR systems is we can't assume that employees are going to log into a HR system, right? They're typically spending most of their time nowadays in some industries in collaborative tools like, say, Slack or Microsoft Teams. And so we need to open up HR systems so that from those collaborative tools, they can trigger processes, HR processes, or they can retrieve information from those HR systems. And we call those sort of micro interactions. So, we take the HR to where the employee is. We don't necessarily have to insist that the employee goes to the HR system. So that's a very exciting area, and I think it's going to be very good for the employee.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Kim, just in general, outside of the technology as well as including the technology, what role should an HR department be playing in delivering a great employee experience these days?
I think it's a really interesting question as to what the responsibility of HR versus the responsibility of HR to be enablers. I think more and more as the demographics of the workplace start to change and we start to have a mix of generations in the workplace, I think it's around giving our employees choice and also empowering them to be able to act upon that choice. Give you an example, the customer engagement world, segmentation is really sophisticated. And at OVO, we've been using attitudinal segmentation for our customer base for a long time. But in the world of HR, we still typically, if we are going to give choice, we will segment on things like demographics or age, gender, that type of stuff, rather than attitude. And actually, we're finding that the needs and the desires of our younger employees are very similar to those of our older employees. And actually, those two age brackets, they're very similar in their attitudes to wanting to have, I guess, things like very involved with the values of the company, wanting to have flexibility in their workplace, wanting to be able to work from home, have flexible hours, those types of things. So I think the employee experience is about HR recognising that different people want different things, and almost starting to look at our employees in the same way we look at consumers, which I know that a lot of companies are, and there's some great examples, but we're at OVO, we're waking up to this.
Fantastic. And it is definitely a common theme that's been developing over Inside HR over the last few months is the idea that we should be thinking about our employees the same way that we think about the range of services and contact we offer our customers. And those sort of two faces of a company sort of almost merging. That sort of takes us very nicely onto talking about changes in management style and thinking about how we manage employees. And we've just thrown a slide up on the screen talking about moving from hierarchical management to people enablement. So, again, actually, Kim, let me turn to you first. This is about agility, isn't it, more than anything? It's talking about how companies can manage in a more agile way and move away from a sort of very structured management format. What are companies doing at the moment to become more agile?
Yeah. Well, James, I think, first of all, I think the first thing to say is that there is almost a burning platform for organisations to increase their agility. As we've seen, competition's increasing, the internet's lowered the barrier to entry for new companies to spring up and grow really, really rapidly. And larger organisations, I think the Deloitte Human Capital Survey for the last 3 years running has found that increasing organisational agility is the number one priority for senior leaders. So organisations recognise that agility is needed. And from my perspective, one of the biggest barriers to organisational agility is the hierarchy. And the hierarchy was really fit for purpose 50 years ago, because it optimizes for efficiency and economies of scale. And when those are the factors that help you to beat your competition, then it's very sensible to have a hierarchy. But these days, when the factors that you need in your organization to be competitive, have competitive advantage, are around speed to market and agility, the hierarchy, with all its spans and layers and handoffs and sign-offs and budgets, just isn't as fit for purpose as it once was. So a lot of organisations are looking out to the market and looking at what else is out there. There are some organisations that are going as far as actually disbanding all management, so holacracy, and probably the most famous example of that is Zappos, who went full no management at all. But for those organisations for whom that's too far, a lot of people are looking at creating networks of team structures. So networks of teams typically are cross-functional teams that have everybody in them in one team needed to make a decision or to solve a customer problem. So to give you an example, I was talking recently to an insurance company, and their HRD was telling me that this was the first time they'd ever put someone from compliance in with product development as one team, and all of a sudden the speed to which products could be developed has increased incredibly, because no longer does product development do something and then at the very last minute the risk and compliance person says, oh no, that's not going to float with the FSA, we can't do it. So instead of having that hierarchical sign-off, everybody's in one team together, and they're able to make much quicker decisions and move a lot more quickly.
That's really interesting. So a lot more agile in decision-making process and time taken, as well as having to get sign-offs from lots of different people. So Richard, as we just heard from Kim, organizational structures, need to change, and the way we manage people needs to change. So we're talking about enabling people rather than managing people as such. What role does HR tech have in that enablement, in this sort of new world of enabling rather than managing?
Yeah, so yeah, with the networks of teams, the old school way of managing people, I think, it's not valid any longer, and it's about, everyone who comes to work in those teams, no one's coming there to do a bad job. We all want to perform. We all want to do good jobs. So it's not about managing performance. It's about enabling performance through empowerment. And what does that mean? It means, helping employees manage their working lives more effectively, help them manage their development, put the control in their hands. Now, when we look at HR systems, from the previous generation, those systems were actually designed for HR. There was a focus around compliance and effectively keeping track of employees. Those kind of systems are not empowering or enabling the workforce at all. In fact, the workforce will typically do everything they possibly can to avoid using those systems. Whereas, the new generation of HR systems, actually calling them HR systems is probably slightly misleading. They're more business systems. And these HR systems, which are really more business systems, they're one of the few systems in your organisation that touch and are touched by every single employee. So the focus for these systems has changed. While we still obviously focus on the hygiene factors, that a HR system, needs to deliver, but it's more now about helping managers be better managers, manage more effectively, data-driven decision-making. It's about, just helping employees take more control of their working lives, provide them with the tools to manage their own development and their own careers. And certainly where you don't necessarily have traditional career paths anymore, where you don't have, you don't progress your career really anymore by promotion. It's more about broadening your experience. Technology has a key role to play in facilitating that and making an organisation more transparent, I would say.
Yeah, exactly. What's interesting as well, actually, if we can just bring in a few of the questions that the audience are sending in. I know we've set aside some time for questions at the end, but we've got a vast number pouring in, and thank you so much for sending those in. Just on this particular topic, the question in here, we talk a lot about the importance of the psychological contract between an employer and employee. Kim, I guess I'm going to direct this towards you. Is that psychological contract, does that change in a more agile working environment?
I think it's a really interesting question, and I think it probably goes to what constitutes the psychological contract. And I think there's lots of different layers. So at the highest level, this is around I, as an employee, expect you as an employer to hold true to your value set. So I've joined you because I believe in your vision and your values, and I expect you now to act in accordance with them. And in that case, I think actually this distributed decision-making and empowered workforce almost strengthens the psychological contract, because people are much more likely to feel that they are empowered and have autonomy and mastery and so forth. And I think the interesting debate comes almost at the more detailed levels. So next level down on the psychological contract might be I'm going to put time and effort into my work, and I expect to be rewarded and recognised in exchange for that. Yeah. And so that's around, to Richard's point, making sure that we are enabling and upskilling our managers in the right way to be great coaches. And even if they are, I think the distributed way of working really includes a very different style of management around empowerment and around facilitation, around coaching, rather than kind of telling somebody what to do. And then the really, really interesting bits come when we come to the actual exchanges, more of the hygiene factors, i.e. I would like career progression and my company has promised this to me. And that's, I think, where we get to some really interesting debate around how do we manage things like job families, reward, career progression, distributed talent management in this new way of working, where it's all about distributed decision making and self-management, and that's before we add in the gig economy.
Yeah, and that leads into a few other things that have come in. Let's just take one more before we move on. So, and this, I guess this is for both of you, but more towards Richard, in the sense that you talked, Richard, about the annual performance review and how that's being scrapped and we're moving towards a more sort of constant feedback model. Questions come in here. Appraisals, performance reviews are inevitably intrinsically linked to reward systems and incentives. So our reward system is going to be flexible enough to be able to respond to the increased pace of change when you don't have a sort of annual stopping point where you stop and check and manage someone's performance and then issue that reward, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a good point. And I think at Workday, as an employee at Workday, we've recently moved away from the annual performance review to continuous check-ins and feedback. And to be honest with you, you probably still need to have that annual check-in, which is linked in some way to the comp review process. However, because you're having the continual check-ins throughout the year, because the focus of the discussion is more on coaching and development rather than focusing purely on the past, I think that annual performance review becomes less of a thing. But yeah, I feel that you will still need it, particularly from a comp perspective. So I don't think that's going to go away. But because you have the regular check-ins, it's a different discussion. It's a different experience.
Okay, and we're about to move into a conversation about the gig economy, but before we do, some of the things that we've talked about, Kim particularly, is the agile nature of management and enabling rather than managing and losing that hierarchical system. Now, I work for a retail business, and we've got questions in here from people who are obviously working in either retail or hospitality as well, where that hierarchical structure just sort of feels like the only way you can go about that particular process. Is this something, is what you're talking about here with enabling rather than managing, is this something that we could apply to that kind of industry as well?
Yes, absolutely. I think that's enabling, and actually I think I was recently at a conference, I was talking to somebody who was HRD for a large retail organisation, and they had just done a initiative where they were essentially empowering their employees who are in the retail outlets to solve problems on behalf of customers. And the way they did it was so interesting. So they provided essentially a set of I guess red lines. I can't remember what they called them, something snazzier than that.
Sure.
But they said, please do not do these following things. And they included some quite generic statements like do anything that threatened the brand, and some very pragmatic, like do not refund over X amount without speaking to a manager to get sign off. But then they said outside of these, I think they called them golden rules. Outside of the golden rules, please do anything that take your initiative and do anything that you would like in order to increase the customer satisfaction with their experience. And that's just an example of almost switching the emphasis from the management onto the employee to almost empower people to be able to solve problems. And that organisation found their employee satisfaction actually really increased as a result. So whilst I think that agile with a capital A, i.e. agile practices and tech agile, probably isn't applicable to on the shop front and retail, but some of the principles around empowerment absolutely are.
Okay. James, I think as well, clearly performance still needs to be managed in this new world, so if there's an issue, it needs to be addressed, but I think the default position needs to be around enabling and empowering.
Sure, absolutely. That takes us very nicely into our next topic, which is preparing for the gig economy, something that's obviously been in the news a huge amount over the last 12 months and very much recently as well. Kim, first off, let's just sort of talk about this very broadly. Is the gig economy a bad thing?
So it's a really interesting question. I think that there are different meanings. I hate the term gig economy because I think right now the gig economy has such negative connotations. So the Uber examples, the Pimlico plumbers, and essentially the gig economy feels like essentially organisations are trying to rip off employees and not give them the benefits they're entitled to. So, so I think right now there's really negative connotations. But actually, if you look, I think, at the future of the workplace, I think it's almost inevitable that most workplaces in the future will be made up of a smaller number of core permanent employees and a much flexible, a much larger flexible, professional, probably freelance type of workforce. I read a really interesting book, and apologies, this is quite out of date. I'm late to the party. Called Exponential Organizations.
Yeah.
And it talks about kind of why new organizations are 10 times better, faster, and cheaper than yours, and what you can do about it, essentially, by Michael Malone and a couple of others. And they talk about exponential organizations being those that grow 10 times faster than their peers. And they look into the reasons why. And essentially one of them is that these organizations have access to assets that they don't own. So they use examples like Airbnb. So Airbnb have leveraged an asset that they don't own, but it's almost a distributed asset. And they also talk about how this applies to human capital. And give lots of examples of organizations that have a much more flexible workforce that are able to flex and I guess to the demands of the market and the consumers, are much more likely to be successful. And actually, when you marry that from an organizational perspective to lots of different research on the demands or the needs on and the desires of both the younger millennial and Gen Z employees, and also the older generation, so the 100-Year Life, which I'm sure is a book everyone's familiar with. The needs of these changing employee base are also that they would prefer to build skills and to have a freelance portfolio career than they would to work for one organisation for a long time. So actually, I think those two trends are going to coincide to mean in the future, and hopefully we won't call it the gig economy anymore, because as I say, it sounds so negative, but I think in the future, organisations will need to embrace this way of working and to ensure that they're treating their freelance employees in an amazing way, so that they'll obviously return.
There is a natural contradiction here, almost, isn't there? In the sort of almost the press around both of these ideas. On the one hand, we're constantly told all of the time that we have a younger workforce that are constantly demanding more and more flexibility, and on the other hand, we have this phrase, the gig economy, which seems to be universally unpopular at the moment, which is almost, you would imagine, the natural reaction to a workforce wanting to be more flexible. Is that the case, or am I missing something, Kim?
No, I completely agree. I think we need a new term, and now I wish I Googled terms before I came on this. There you go.
We could have invented one here today, yeah.
Yes. Anyone's got a great term that's more positive than the gig economy, then pop it on the chat.
Click on the questions button and send in your new name for the gig economy, and we'll read some of those out at the end of the hour. Richard, turning to you. Obviously, as the gig economy grows, or if we take Kim's advice and avoid using that phrase, if this more flexible working structure and relationship between employee-employer grows, what does HR need to do differently to accommodate that?
Well, I mean, latching on to Kim's point there about how contractors, freelancers, gig workers are growing in number and becoming an ever larger segment of the workforce. You look at how those type of worker are currently managed. They're typically managed in a procurement system, where you just make sure you pay their invoices. They're not typically stored in a HR system. But as that segment gets bigger as a part of the workforce, and we consider them effectively to be part of our extended enterprise and part of our ability to deliver service to our customers, develop new products, etc., etc. What one would think that again, this depends upon how the gig worker, the legal definition of the gig worker, and how that all pans out, in the courts. But you would expect to want to manage those workers in your HR system alongside your employees, and they'll have different needs. So, we have sort of these app-generated gigs, so those types of workers, so like your Uber driver, and from a HR perspective, for those types of workers, you're probably focusing on attracting them, bringing them to your organisation, getting them signed up, onboarding them, which probably got some kind of compliance training in there as well to ensure the compliance of whatever your business is. Probably also some kind of scheduling, although that's a slightly dodgy area when you're looking at gig workers. But then if you look at freelancers who are kind of at the other end of the spectrum from a gig perspective, these are typically highly skilled people, probably got skills that you don't have in your organisation, very niche skills that you need to bring in on a project basis, and these are probably highly paid people. From a HR perspective, it's there more of a talent play. So you're looking at building talent pools that you can dip into as you need. You want more sort of intelligent skills matching and project matching. So matching freelancers to the projects that you've got ongoing, and it's also about retaining that talent in your talent pools. So I think HR systems, they need to step up and facilitate the sort of the more advanced management of this ever-growing segment of the workforce to make sure that the extended enterprise, is as successful as possible from the people perspective.
That's really interesting. I always have to remember that I have to be careful what I start here on HR, Inside HR, because I've had a stream of new names. The gig economy, we've got the freelance economy, the port economy, the flex economy,
nice.
the free economy, which almost sounds like Freakonomics, that famous book from a while ago, doesn't it? Thank you to the one who sent in Ryan Giggs economy. That tickled me. But yeah, no, really, thank you very much for your response on that. There is just below that a really interesting question, Kim. Flexibility shouldn't mean insecurity, should it? How, from sort of an employment perspective, do we make sure that people can have flexibility, but that doesn't mean lack of security and financial insecurity as well?
Yeah, I think it's a really it's an interesting time. It's an interesting time to be alive. I think that in the future, so I've been reading about lots of different platforms that enable the people who want freelance work to almost kind of store and log their experience, so that potential employers can search those, and I think those types of platforms will become more ubiquitous, and also as we start to be able to, obviously already we're talking to you on a webinar, as technology starts to enable remote working, the choice for people become much more global. So I think that right now, because those technologies perhaps platforms aren't as sophisticated as they will be in the future, right now it feels like, oh goodness, if my freelance work ends, how am I going to find another gig or another flexible piece of work? But actually, I think there's a whole growing infrastructure around helping to enable this from both the employer and the employee. So I think the insecurity will be much less in the future. But I think you're right. Right now, it feels more of a risk for employees.
Great stuff. Well, we will return to some questions on the gig economy and flexible working towards the end of the hour in about sort of 10-15 minutes time when we take some of your questions. But I do want to move us on. We've got a couple of topics to cover before we finish. And before we do that, I do want to ask you another question, our second poll of the hour. Are you using or do you plan to use AI in your HR practice? We're going to talk about AI, what that is and how it's being used already. But first, we just wanted to get your feelings on this. Is it answer A, yes, we've already launched our AI HR solution? Is it B, we're currently developing an AI solution? Is it C, it's something we're looking at implementing right now? Is it D, it's something we're not doing in the short term? Or is it E, no, we don't have any plans to use AI in our HR function right now? So let us know where you are with that, please. Do click on the vote button and vote in those polls. Thank you for those of you who are already doing it. My screen is already jumping with votes coming in. Thank you so much for that. We'll get the answers to that in just a few minutes, so please do answer now, and then we'll bring Richard and Kim in on your thoughts. But moving us on to talk about AI, Richard, let's talk about what AI is, first of all, and then what impacts do you think it will have on HR moving forward?
Yeah, so from my perspective, when we look at AI, I can see three main kind of services that can be provided to HR. So you've got what we call knowledge services. So this is using machine learning to spot patterns, if you like, in data. So looking at millions and millions of data points that us as humans, there's no way we could spot the patterns. So using these algorithms to spot those patterns, and sort of use cases around that would be things like analysing your employee data to highlight any employees that the algorithm might think are at risk of leaving, or trying to predict future performance. So that would be sort of your knowledge services. And also there are quite a lot of ethical considerations to think about. So for instance, if you warn or if you highlight an employee as being at risk of leaving, does the manager then start treating that employee differently, perhaps potentially in a negative way, showing them the cold shoulder, whereas it's just an algorithm saying that it thinks they're at risk of leaving, and perhaps they're not at all. So there are ethical considerations, and I think the industry is working its way through those kind of questions. The second type of service would be around vision services. So there it's about interpreting visual data. So a very simple example would be an employee is processing an expense claim with their phone. They take a photo of a receipt. The vision service is able to interpret that receipt, extract the value of the expense claim, perhaps even work out what type of expense claim it is. So that's sort of your vision services, and there's a lot of clever things going on in that area. And then finally, we have language services. So there we're talking about using natural language processing to sit behind chatbots. And I saw I was reading about a good example of this yesterday, in fact, around a HR policy chatbot. So with this chatbot, you've got all of your HR policies, in Word documents, in PDF files. You upload those to the chatbot platform. It runs its algorithms against that content, and then the employee is able via that chatbot to ask policy questions, and then the chatbot will do its best to answer those questions. But then you can think there are pretty much chatbots emerging for everything. You've got chatbots for candidates who are applying. You've got chatbots to help managers when they're doing performance reviews. So there's a proliferation of these things, and I think they're kind of like breeding like rabbits, if you like. So organizations need to have a clear strategy around AI to avoid a kind of a chaos of different AI tools, which would potentially give a poor employee experience. And then my final point, before I hand over to or give Kim a chance to say something, is these AI tools, they need data, right? If they don't have any data, they're useless, because they need to learn. So you need to feed them data. And then if we look at HR AI, so HR AI tools need HR data, they need people data. And when we look at, the last couple of years, organizations have been on their, and they're probably still on, like a GDPR journey. So they've got, hopefully all of their people data safely secured in a HR system with a robust security model controlling who can access the data and who can do what with it. You need to think carefully about where you're going to send that people data, because if you have to send that data to these remote AI platforms so that they can learn about your people, as soon as that HR data leaves your control, how does that impact your ability to remain GDPR compliant? So it's all about, choosing those AI partners carefully. There's a lot of innovation out there, but bringing that innovation close to your HR system, I would suggest. But as the poll there shows, and the data on the slide show, it's still quite early days. There's a lot of noise, I think, around AI, but a lot of us are beginning to dip our toes in the water. So I think the impact's going to be massive. I think. And final point, Kim, I promise. I think it's about. Because I'm a positive, half glass full type of person. I think it's about augmentation rather than replacement of people. Some jobs will inevitably change or go, but I think when I look at when I started my career to now, and all the tools that I have now that are making me much more efficient and productive, but I'm still busier now than I've ever been before, despite all of those tools. So I'm optimistic that a lot of these tools will open up new opportunities, new types of jobs, and will allow us to do more interesting work.
Great stuff. And Kim, yes, just before I do bring you in, Richard just referenced the poll there. Remember, we asked, are you using or do you plan to use AI in your HR practice? 2/3 of our respondents are in the bottom two boxes. It's not something that we'll do in the short term, or it's not something we have any plans to do at all right now. So it is obviously, as Richard says, very early days. Kim, what do we think the more macro effects of AI are going to be, maybe perhaps even outside of HR or management on the workplace?
So I agree with Richard that I don't think AI is going to have some of the doomsday effects that we have been reading about over the past few years, about jobs being completely changed and the entire organisation being turned on its head. But I do think it will have an impact. So to give you an example, I was reading about an AI algorithm that had started to become better at humans at diagnosing brain tumours.
Right.
So looking essentially, as Richard mentioned, about the data, so feeding this algorithm data from previous scans, and obviously then the consultant's outcome on that, or their diagnosis, and then teaching the algorithm how to diagnose a brain tumour in a way that is essentially more effective than a human. And that is very exciting, first and foremost, but also has an impact on the way we think about jobs versus tasks. So in this example, you might have previously had a consultant or somebody who specialised in brain tumours, doing everything from looking at the scan, making the diagnosis, speaking to the patient and the family, and so forth. Whereas now, actually, we need to probably think about those tasks as different elements. So looking at the scan might be done by a bot, and then delivering the diagnosis to the patient would obviously be entirely driven by a human. So it's just around making the distinction between tasks, which I think have an interesting impact on the way we think about jobs in the workplace. The second thing I think is that we inevitably AI will bring change to our organisations, and so therefore thinking about how we reskill our people to respond to that change is going to be key. And it's very similar actually. So at OVO, because we scale so rapidly, and we also we moved from being a pure kilowatt hour provider, so i.e. we provide you with just energy, electricity and gas, to much more of an NTech provider. We always knew we were going to pivot and change. So from the very beginning, we've recruited purely on learning agility. Rather than previous experience. So essentially an individual's psychological readiness to adapt and respond to change. And I think that a lot of organisations, in the light of not only AI, but all of the other changes that are coming over the hill, are starting to think about recruitment for agility rather than recruitment for competency. And then the last point, I promise, is around back to my earlier rant about the hierarchy.
It does tie in with that, doesn't it? It does tie in with your enabling slightly less hierarchical structure for an organisation.
Absolutely, no, entirely, because I think that as AI, so AI is going to, or machine learning certainly, is going to become better and better and cheaper at automating the repetitive, frequent tasks. So things, they can be complex, but we need data to teach the algorithm, so they need to be frequent and they need to be repetitive. And so essentially a lot of organizations have gained competitive advantage because they have economies of scale. And actually, as we start to automate some of these frequent and repetitive tasks, and the cost of these technologies come down, the essentially economies of scale advantage is going to become less and less, and so therefore the competitive advantage is going to be more around innovation, meeting customer need, agility and speed, all of which the hierarchy is not really fit for purpose to do. So that's my last rant about the hierarchy.
No, I saw a great phrase the other day. I've been struggling to remember where I saw it, but it basically said exactly what you just said there, which is fast is the new big. So it's not about scale anymore, it's about speed and efficiency. That does actually move us very neatly onto our last topic of the morning before we start taking your questions, and it's all around people analytics and doing more with data. Now, Richard just said that the AI is only as strong as the data you put into it. Richard, this is our final topic for discussion. How can organizations maximize the opportunity that people analytics is offering?
Yeah, so I'm particularly interested in people analytics, I have to say, and I think the business case is clear, and I think it's difficult to find anyone who'd argue against data-driven decision making. And we've just sponsored some research by the CIPD on people analytics, which reinforced the alignment between having a strong analytics culture and high business performance.
And just quickly, Richard, sorry to interrupt, just quickly, there is a link to that in the attachments as well. So if you're interested in that particular piece of research, do click on the attachments button and click on that link. Sorry, Richard, carry on.
Yeah, no worries. And yeah, that came out just last week, so it's hot off the press. But the thing with people analytics is, which we've found as well with this research, is it's not easy, right? So and one of the biggest blockers to embarking on this people analytics journey is around actually gathering the data together and being able to start the analysis, because the data is typically spread across multiple systems. It's in spreadsheets. It's all over the place. So step one, I would say, is to kind of try and rationalize where that data is and pull it together into some kind of central people hub. And that could be your HR system where it's secured, or wherever you think, but bring that data together as a first step. The other interesting thing that the CIPD research brought out was that there's quite low confidence levels in HR, particularly in the UK, to tackle people analytics. It was a sort of a lack of skills and confidence in the area of people analytics. And I think, I wasn't that surprised by that, to be honest. And that's not detrimental to HR at all. It's just that, we're not all Google with data scientists walking the floor, looking for the next big problem to solve. A lot of us are smaller organizations, we just don't have those skills in-house, and those skills are extremely expensive. And when I talked about retention risk earlier, try and build your own machine learning retention risk algorithm. That's extremely difficult and extremely expensive and time consuming. So I think you need to look at those systems that are packaging in those kind of people analytics to give you that head start, so you don't have to build from scratch. And those systems that package in the people analytics, what you need to do then is provide the data, feed those analytics the data, and then your focus is on interpreting the results. And then the other great thing I think about people analytics, where it spreads it more into business analytics, is I think HR, we can really help the business answer those particularly difficult questions by combining the people data, and we've got more people data than ever before, by combining that people data with information and data from other corporate systems, could be customer systems, sales systems, whatever it may be, or even external data to help answer those much bigger questions. And
let me bring... Sorry, Richard,
yeah.
I was going to say, let me just bring Kim in on that, because we've got just a few minutes before we get to questions. As a Chief People Officer, Kim, what impact do you believe people analytics is going to have on the HR function?
So I think, first of all, I would say that it's becoming much more important. I was reading a KPMG study that said that the proportion of chief HR officers that sit on execos of FTSE 100 has moved from 68% in 2011 to 70% in 2016, which obviously is not good enough, obviously, but the trend is going in the right direction. And this study looked at essentially asking the CEOs of these organisations, what do you value in your chief HR officer? And they came back with genuine commercial understanding, ability to contribute across a broad business agenda, but very importantly was the ability to harness data and present evidence-driven approaches and solutions. So I think it's becoming much, much, much more important. And I mean, I'm a bit of a geek, so I love what we can do with data. I love the fact that data is becoming much more real-time. For example, moving away from the annual employee engagement survey to much more of a continual pulse, always on. And I love the fact that we are seeing more organisations, as Richard mentioned, really looking at correlating people data with business metrics. so that we can essentially say what we as a profession have known all along. HR is not soft and fluffy. It is absolutely core and essential to every business strategy.
Absolutely. Hear, hear. Great stuff. Just quickly, I'm getting a little bit of feedback that a couple of the links in the attachments are not working. Do not fear. We will throw up a slide at the end that has all of the links on it, so you can write them down old style and type them into your browser and go to them that way as well. So bear with us, and we'll get that up on the screen for you very shortly. So that's sort of a number of quite big topics covered very, very quickly, and I know there are a huge amount of questions coming in. Thank you so much for sending those all in. I've got a time just to pop a few of them to Richard and Kim here. They're all on a broad number of topics. The gig economy's been an area that's really provoked a lot of questions. But I want to start with something that I think, Richard, you touched on very briefly when we talked about AI. Do we think that AI can be dangerous in the sense that it's machine-based learning and subject to potential bias, particularly in areas such as recruitment? Richard, you did touch on that a little bit. What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I mean that's an excellent point, and research that's out there highlights that point. So, for instance, if you are an organisation that is chiefly made up of white middle-aged males, and you look at your recruitment data, it will show, as you feed the algorithms, it will show that you're always hiring white middle-aged males. So that algorithm may well start making recommendations based upon that bias. So I think it's Josh Berzin actually released some research a couple of days ago where he talked about how AI, most AI at the moment is kind of like a black box, whereas actually we need to open that box up, make it more transparent so that you can refine to some extent the way the AI operates to remove that bias if it's felt there is some bias in the AI. So, as I said right at the beginning, the AI is only as good as the data you feed it.
Sure. Absolutely. This is an interesting one, and it's a topic we haven't. It links to a topic that we haven't really touched on yet, but I'd like to. What role can technology in the workplace play in improving mental health and well-being of employees in the future of work? Kim, what have you seen in terms of the future of work, the technology, some of the AI, everything that we've talked about, being pointed towards maintaining well-being and mental health?
Yeah, so I think, again, I'm an optimist in this, and I actually think there's great potential in this particular sphere for technology to really add to an employee's experience. So, to give you an example, at OVO, we're a big fan of mindfulness, and we use a mindfulness app, Headspace, which we give out to our employees, and we really encourage people. So, because the app reminds you to just take a minute in the middle of your day, for example, it kind of gives you nudges and so forth. I think that actually that's a very small example of where technology is really helping to do something in a way that going on a mindfulness course wouldn't be as effective on its own, because it might not remind you to kind of keep and form the habit.
And sorry, Kim, just quickly, there's another question here that links, which is with reference to flexible working. There was an article on Radio 4 yesterday morning that alluded to the correlation between flexible working and loneliness at work. Mostly is a lack of connections that can have a negative impact on the employee's psyche. How would we advise that HR counteract this and encourage a healthy balance? So I guess that's kind of linked with well-being, flexible working, and people therefore working more remotely, more alone, not being in a workspace 9 to 5, and that having a psychological effect. There are a lot of very interesting technological solutions out there that are helping combat this, aren't there?
Yes, and I think that, again, it's part of this transition period that we're in right now. I think as flexible working, I love some of the names, so as the free economy or the flex economy becomes more ubiquitous, I actually think that the transition won't be as bumpy. So, for example, already there are co-working spaces springing up all over London and other cities. And at the moment, I think most, for example, if I was working from home, I might feel a bit strange going going into one of these. But actually, as this becomes the normal way of working, I think that there'll be much more facilities. And then I also think that the organisation, as this becomes more ubiquitous, will stop treating their freelancers as externals and start actually welcoming them into feeling part of the family. And I think at the moment there's still that divide between permanent employees and non-permanent, but as this becomes the norm, those barriers will break down. But I agree with you that we do need to, as employers, really pay attention to problems like loneliness and obviously mental well-being.
Absolutely. Richard, I'm going to give one last one to you. UK productivity is patchy at best. What's the one key thing organisations can do or should be doing to raise productivity?
Gosh, you've hit me with a hard question.
Pick one, 30 seconds, go.
Yeah. Well, it seems the more tools we give the employees, the less productive they become. So there's a negative correlation or an inverse correlation. I actually think we've mentioned it many times in this webcast today. It's about empowering and enabling the workforce.
Sure.
And Kim talked about it very eloquently about team-based working. I think that new way of working and that new perspective, you're not managing, you're empowering. I think that will help us with that productivity conundrum.
Fantastic. As you can see, we have thrown up the web addresses for the links, perhaps a couple that weren't working behind the attachment button, so apologies for that, but please do take those down, copy them, and go and check out all of those resources, including stuff from Workday. We talked about the People Analytics study that they did with the CIPD. There's a link to that there as well. Please do go and look at all that stuff. Please also don't forget to rate the webinar. Apart from my pronunciation, obviously, do click on the rate this button and rate the webinar. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Inside HR is back this time next week, so please do look out on the Bright Talk platforms and in your email inboxes for that. Richard and Kim, thank you so much for joining me this morning. I hope you enjoyed your first experience of Inside HR.
Thank you very much. Yeah, great.
Absolutely.
Great stuff. We hope to have you back again. And to everyone listening, wherever you are, thank you very much and goodbye.